I don't know if it was pride or something simpler, but buying a house felt like crossing a line I'd waited my entire life to approach. It was my first home, a place I could call mine. It was a humble little 2-bedroom, brick-faced and sturdy, the kind of place that practically whispered, "You've done it, this is what you worked for." And it was. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. Enough to mean something, enough to be a place where I could, at long last, find peace. It wasn't easy getting here. I'm not someone who grew up with everything handed to them, quite the opposite. Actually, my parents taught me hard work, independence, and resilience. They wanted me to be self-sufficient, to do something with my life. And I did, scrimping and saving over the years until I could finally afford this small slice of independence. A home that stood as proof of every late night and early morning. There was something special about walking through an empty house and knowing you could shape it however you wanted. That first week, I moved through every room with a lightness in my chest I'd never known. The sun streamed in from the east every morning, filling the kitchen with a warmth that made me linger over my coffee. I arranged my bookshelves exactly the way I liked, filled the closet with my things, and nestled into the master bedroom with its wide, comforting space and its tall window that looked out over the quiet street. I slept soundly, wrapped in a peace I hadn't known was possible. Then came the news that my parents were planning to stay with me for a while. It wasn't something I'd expected. Not so soon, but I thought I could handle it. They were my parents, after all, the ones who'd worked so hard to give me everything they could. If they wanted to spend a few weeks here, what harm could it do? I imagined dinners at my table, laughter echoing through the rooms, the warmth of family around me, and if I'm honest, part of me thought it would be a nice way to show them what I'd built. I wanted them to be proud, but I hadn't realized how much I'd come to cherish the space as mine. Or how the subtle shift of them moving in would soon unearth a tension I hadn't anticipated. Those first few days were a lesson in patience and restraint. I'd set out towels, made sure they had all they needed, even went grocery shopping for the things they liked. I thought it would be easy, helpful, even to share my home, but little adjustments began to wear on me more than I'd like to admit. The living room, which I'd decorated in soft blues and greys, soon had a few of my mother's decorations peppered around, a bright, tasseled throw over my leather chair, family photos crowding the small shelf by the door. These were small things, I knew, but they felt bigger than they were. I picked everything so carefully, and now my choices were layered with their own. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as temporary and unimportant. And for a few days, that worked. My parents seemed genuinely happy to be here. They cooked, they laughed, they filled the house with the comfortable bustle I'd grown up with. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated. I think it's because I'd never imagined it happening. After all, this was my house. It was only the third night when they asked me to move out of the master bedroom. I was stunned. They asked with a sort of casualness. My father shrugging, my mother offering a little smile. Wouldn't it make more sense? They asked. They were guests, and shouldn't the guests have the bigger room? In that moment, my feelings couldn't have been more divided. Part of me thought they were joking. But no, they were completely serious, and a wave of feelings came crashing over me, so quickly that I barely had time to sort through them. Shock, confusion, a flicker of anger, and then shame for even feeling angry. They're my parents, I told myself. They gave me everything I have. Why wouldn't I give them the best? But there was another voice in my head, quieter but persistent, whispering, "This is your home, don't you deserve this too?" I was embarrassed by how much I wanted to say no. My heart pounded at the thought of just politely declining. And maybe they sensed my hesitation. Or maybe I was just that bad at hiding my disappointment. But my mother quickly added, "Of course, it's only if you're comfortable with it." But I could never say no to my parents. Not when it came to something they thought was right. In my mind, it was part respect, part guilt, and part a feeling I couldn't name, something that pulled at me. Told me I owed them more than a few square feet in a house. I nodded and said, "Of course," even as my voice shook just a little. That night, I moved my things to the smaller room. I tried not to think of it as a demotion, as though I'd been knocked down a peg in my own house. But each time I looked at the bigger room, a little piece of my excitement, the pride I'd felt when I first moved in, seemed to drift away. At first, it was just the room. But slowly, my parents filled the house in ways I hadn't predicted. They reorganized things with a subtlety that only a parent could manage. The living room's throw pillows were always adjusted in the way they thought was better. My mother would rearrange the dishes, moving my coffee mugs to a different cabinet so they were easier to reach. The first few times, I put things back in their place without comment. But over the days, I felt myself moving slower, sighing when I entered a room. It was still my house, but it didn't feel quite like my own. Their presence was both a comfort and a frustration, a blend that made me feel like I was being torn between two places. I loved them deeply, wanted to share my life with them in some way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement wasn't right, that their well-meaning changes were unraveling the sense of independence I'd fought so hard to build. I caught myself tiptoeing around my own kitchen, easing drawers open, careful not to let them clatter. I'd catch my mother's eye across the room, her smile warm, as though she could read my discomfort. But she would never say anything. We were caught in a silent dance, each of us trying to keep the other comfortable, but both of us stepping on toes. In quieter moments, I tried to soothe myself with rationalizations. They're my parents, they're just making themselves comfortable. But another thought pressed in, one that refused to let me go. Why am I so afraid to say something? This was the disruption I hadn't anticipated, a chipping away at the foundation of my independence. I'd always been proud of being close to my family, but as the days went on, I realized that closeness can be too close, especially when it's at the expense of your own peace. As the days turned into weeks, my attempts to ignore the tension only sharpened it. I told myself to let go, to keep the peace. They were family. After all, I was overreacting, wasn't I? And yet, as I lay on the narrow bed in the smaller room every night, watching the shadows crawl along the ceiling, a quiet resentment started to grow within me. I found myself avoiding the master bedroom even when they were out, as though stepping inside would only remind me of the subtle control they seemed to have taken over my life here. I'd begun to feel like a guest in my own home, each room tinged with a feeling of impermanence. I hadn't expected that something so small, like a shift in room assignments, would bring up so many old emotions, feelings I thought I'd buried long ago. But there they were, whispering doubts in the quiet. It was easy to pretend during the day. I'd smile, ask my parents if they needed anything, and fall into the same rhythms I'd known growing up. But underneath, I started to resent these little rituals, to see them as tiny chains keeping me bound to the expectations of who I was supposed to be. I resented myself even more for how easily I'd slipped into this role. How natural it felt to let them take charge. The sacrifices they'd made, the support they'd given me, all these memories kept me silent, kept me obedient, but the silence was slowly starting to erode me. Some nights, I lay awake, fantasizing about reclaiming my space. I imagined walking into the master bedroom, tossing my things onto the bed as though to make a point. But even in my imagination, I couldn't go through with it. That quiet guilt was a weight I couldn't shake. With every week that passed, I felt my own grip on the house slipping further. It wasn't just the master bedroom anymore. My parents had a way of asserting themselves over the smallest details. I'd find the thermostat set a few degrees higher or lower, depending on their comfort. My favorite reading chair turned to face a different direction, and the pantry reorganized to fit their idea of efficiency. Each adjustment felt like an erasure of my own decisions, my own presence. I found myself falling into patterns I hadn't known since high school, skirting around their opinions, choosing words carefully, hiding my annoyance behind thin smiles. I even started getting up early to make my own coffee before they could, as though drinking it first would somehow establish my claim over this small slice of routine. But even that became a dance. My mother began to anticipate my movements, joining me in the kitchen as though she sensed I was trying to steal a few moments of peace. There was no escape, no corner of the house untouched by their influence. One afternoon, after coming back from work, I found that they'd rearranged my bookshelf. The books that I'd organized in a careful, sentimental order were now categorized by genre, lined up neatly but devoid of any personal meaning. My heart sank. It was a small thing, a detail no one else would notice, but it felt like the last thread snapping. Here, in the home I'd worked so hard to make my own, even my own little arrangements weren't respected. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but instead, I said nothing. I took a deep breath, swallowed my frustration, and smiled. But inside, a voice I hadn't heard before began to grow louder, telling me I couldn't go on like this. I needed to take control back, to stand up for myself, even if it meant causing a rift I was desperate to avoid. I'd always been close to my parents, bound by a sense of loyalty and love that felt unbreakable. I grew up knowing that their sacrifices paved the way for me to stand on my own, to succeed in ways they hadn't been able to. How could I then ever deny them anything? How could I risk hurting them over something as trivial as a room? But late at night, the memories came back, moments from my childhood that painted a different story. I remembered the times I'd felt crushed under their expectations, the way their well-meaning guidance sometimes felt like pressure, a silent force shaping me in ways I couldn't resist. They'd always wanted the best for me. I knew that, but as I grew older, I realized that what they saw as best wasn't always what I wanted for myself. It had taken years to find my own voice, to let go of the feeling that I had to live up to their dreams. This house was supposed to be my declaration of independence, a place to finally be the person I wanted to be. But somehow, in a matter of weeks, I felt myself slipping back into the role of a child, obedient, compliant, desperate for their approval. I realized, then, that this wasn't just about the master bedroom or the bookshelves or the thermostat. This was about reclaiming the person I'd fought to become. And if I let this go, if I kept sacrificing pieces of myself for the sake of keeping them happy, I knew I'd lose myself in the process. It happened on a Sunday morning. My mother had decided to rearrange the kitchen pantry for better flow. As she put it, I walked in, bleary-eyed and still half asleep, to find that every jar, every can, every little piece of my carefully stocked pantry had been shifted, organized according to her vision, not mine. I felt the frustration boiling over, a tight knot in my chest that I couldn't ignore. I couldn't say a word. I didn't trust myself to keep the calm facade I'd perfected over the weeks. Instead, I turned and walked out, leaving my parents in the kitchen without an explanation. I went back to my room, the small, cramped room that barely felt like my own, and sat on the bed. Breathing heavily, my mind raced through the weeks of tension, the silent frustrations, the feelings of being an outsider in my own space. I knew, in that moment, that I had to do something. I couldn't keep bending, couldn't keep erasing myself just to make them comfortable. And with that realization came a quiet, determined resolve. I would reclaim my space, my independence. I would take back the room that was rightfully mine. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. The thought of facing my parents, of standing up to them, terrified me. It wasn't in my nature to confront them. I'd spent my entire life avoiding conflict, choosing peace over pride. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like a choice between staying true to myself or continuing to live as a shadow in my own home. I spent the afternoon walking through the house, grounding myself, finding the courage to assert my boundaries. Every step felt like a challenge, a test of whether I could actually go through with it. But the voice in my head had changed. It was no longer filled with self-doubt or guilt. It was filled with clarity. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that setting boundaries didn't mean I loved them any less. It was possible to honor my parents and respect my own needs, to love them without sacrificing myself in the process. That evening, I took a deep breath and walked into the master bedroom. I began moving my things back, carefully but with a steady determination. My parents watched from the doorway, their expressions a mix of surprise and confusion, but they didn't say a word. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. This was my space, my decision. As I arranged my things, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The house felt different, lighter somehow. I'd reclaimed not just a room, but a part of myself that I'd nearly lost in my efforts to please others. It felt like freedom. In the days that followed, a quiet understanding settled over the house. My parents didn't protest or push back. Instead, they seemed to accept my decision with a gentle, unspoken respect. There was still tension, a lingering discomfort in the air, but it was manageable, and for the first time, I felt at peace in my own home. When they left a few weeks later, I found myself standing alone in the empty house, filled with a strange mix of sadness and relief. I loved them deeply, that would never change. But I'd learned that love didn't have to come at the expense of my own happiness, my own space. As I walked through each room, I felt a newfound gratitude for the journey, for the lessons I'd learned about self-respect and independence. This house was mine, and now, so was my life.